It did not crash because of a storm or a terrorist attack or a pilot mistake. It broke apart in the sky because of something left behind more than 20 years ago. China Airlines Flight 611 took off from Taipei just like it had hundreds of times before. The weather was good, the passengers were relaxed, the crew followed every step of the checklist, and the radar showed a clean climb. But 20 minutes later, the plane disappeared from the screen without a single warning, without a call, without a chance to say goodbye. This was not a malfunction that screamed. It was a silence that tore everything apart. Welcome back to True Scary Air Disaster Stories, where we uncover the quiet mistakes that cost the most. Today we are telling the story of a flight that flew for more than 2 decades with a secret hidden deep inside its body. And when it finally gave out, there was no time left to fix it. This is the story of China Airlines Flight 611. So before we begin, how are you feeling today? I hope you are well and breathing easy, because what happened on this flight is a reminder that the most dangerous problems are not always the ones we can see or hear. They are often the ones we stopped looking for. On the afternoon of May 25th, 2009, passengers boarded China Airlines Flight 611 at Taipei International Airport. The flight was a routine journey to Hong Kong, just a little over an hour long, the kind of short hop that barely gave time to settle in before descending again. The aircraft assigned was a Boeing 747, a giant of the skies with decades of flight behind it. It had flown internationally, it had flown domestically, and today it was just another trip on a quiet Saturday. The plane had recently undergone maintenance, the weather was calm, and the crew was experienced. Leading the flight was Captain Ching Chuang Shu, a seasoned pilot with more than 10,000 hours in the air. His crew included First Officer Liu and a full team of cabin attendants. Most of the 225 people on board were families, business travelers, and tourists. Nothing unusual, no tension, no storm, no delay. Flight 611 pushed back from the gate at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and lifted off a few minutes later, climbing steadily into the warm blue sky. Radar tracked the aircraft as it ascended through 30,000 feet, then 34,000. It was cleared for cruising altitude at 35,000 feet and maintained a smooth climb heading southwest. Everything about the flight looked normal from the ground. Air traffic controllers noted no abnormalities. There were no distress calls, no warning lights, no change in speed or altitude. For the people inside the plane, it was a quiet, uneventful ride. Some passengers watched through the windows, others read from magazines or dozed off. The seatbelt signs turned off, the drink carts began to roll, and the sound of jet engines hummed behind the silence. The pilots followed standard procedure, making calm, routine reports to the control tower with no hint of trouble. It would have been impossible for anyone to know that in less than 10 minutes, everything would fall apart. It is important to understand that this aircraft was not young. It had been in service for more than 22 years, and during that time it had completed over 20,000 flights. That in itself is not unusual. Airplanes are built to last. What matters is not how old a plane is, but how well it has been maintained, and whether every part of it is exactly what it should be every time it leaves the ground. The problem is that not all wounds are visible, not all repairs are equal, and not every inspection finds what it was meant to find. Sometimes something breaks and it never gets truly fixed. It gets patched and passed. It gets noted and forgotten. Over time, a crack becomes a line, and a line becomes a fracture, and one day that fracture stops waiting. That was what was inside Flight 611. A weakness that no one saw and no one stopped. A mistake not from that day, but from a generation before. While the passengers watched clouds pass beneath their feet, that mistake was already waking up from its long sleep. At 3:37 p.m., China Airlines Flight 611 vanished from radar screens. One moment it was cruising at 35,000 feet heading southwest toward Hong Kong, and the next it was gone. There was no mayday, no emergency call, no transponder signal, no sudden drop in altitude, just silence. To the controllers on the ground, it made no sense. The aircraft had been stable with no sign of trouble, and yet now there was nothing. The first instinct was to think it was a system glitch, a temporary loss of signal, a momentary blip in tracking. But seconds turned to minutes, and there was still no response. Control towers tried to hail the flight again and again, but the cockpit never answered. Nearby aircraft were contacted to attempt visual contact, and one pilot flying a commercial route reported something that made everyone stop. He said he saw debris in the sky, large pieces of metal falling from high altitude, shimmering in the sunlight and scattering into the ocean. It was a statement that shifted the entire tone of the search. The plane had not disappeared. It had disintegrated in midair. Air traffic control declared an emergency and alerted search and rescue teams. They scrambled helicopters and ships to scan the waters between Taiwan and the coast of mainland China, the area where the radar signal was last received. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Pieces of fuselage floating in the sea seats, insulation suitcases, fragments of the wing and tail all spread across miles of open water. There was no fireball, no explosion, no crater on the ground. The plane had simply come apart in the sky and fallen into silence. When news reached the media, the public response was immediate. People demanded answers. How could a Boeing 747 simply tear itself apart on a calm, clear day? How could there be no warning? How could an entire flight vanish without a trace of distress? And at the center of it all was a mystery that no one could yet explain. Radar logs showed a normal flight path. The weather data showed no turbulence, no storm, no wind shear, nothing external had gone wrong. The only clue was the pattern of debris. Some parts of the aircraft were found dozens of kilometers apart, suggesting that the plane had not come down in one piece, but had instead broken into large sections while still in the air. Investigators marked the positions of each recovered component and began reconstructing a map of the wreckage. What they saw pointed to something terrifying. The tail had separated first, then the rear fuselage, then the rest of the body shattered. The nose and cockpit had gone down last and fast. It was as if the airplane had peeled itself open from back to front. This was not a controlled descent. It was structural failure, the kind that gives no warning and no mercy. And all of it had happened within moments. There was no time for the crew to react, no opportunity to explain or even understand. Passengers had likely been seated reading talking, resting unaware that beneath their feet the very bones of the plane were giving way. The recovery operation took days. Dozens of ships, helicopters, and divers were deployed to search the waters between the west coast of Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. What they found was heartbreaking. The wreckage was scattered across a wide area, floating on the surface and resting deep beneath the waves. Investigators marked the positions of each major section and quickly realized that the aircraft had not hit the water as a whole. It had broken apart in midair. The tail was found miles away from the nose. The main fuselage had split into multiple pieces. The wings had detached and crashed separately. It was clear that the plane had come apart while still at cruising altitude. Among the wreckage, they recovered personal belongings. Clothing wallets, photographs, children's toys, things that had been inside the cabin when everything gave way. Human remains were found in clusters tied to the sections where the cabin had torn open. Some passengers were still strapped into their seats, still facing forward, still holding magazines as if the moment had frozen in place. There were no signs of struggle, no sign of evacuation. Whatever had happened instantly. The voice recorder provided no clues. The cockpit had been quiet. The flight data recorder showed no changes in speed or altitude, no system warnings, nothing out of the ordinary. The plane had simply ceased to exist in a single moment. Investigators turned to the physical evidence. They began reconstructing the pieces, assembling the remains of the tail section, the fuselage, the wings. What they discovered would lead them not just to a failure, but to a mistake made decades earlier. The structural failure had started at the rear of the aircraft. The break had originated in the aft fuselage near a pressure bulkhead that had been repaired years before. As they examined the metal, they found something that should not have been there. A pattern of fatigue cracks, the kind that develop slowly over thousands of pressurization cycles. The kind that only form when something is not quite right. And then they saw it. A repair patch. A large section of the fuselage had been cut and reinforced with a metal doubler, a standard fix for structural damage. But this patch had been installed incorrectly. The repair had not matched the manufacturer's specifications. Instead of overlapping the doubler as designed, it had been aligned edge to edge. This meant that the stress from every flight had been concentrated along a single line. For more than 20 years, the aircraft had flown with a hidden weakness invisible to the eye, but growing stronger with every takeoff and landing. On that day, the metal had finally given up. The crack had reached a critical length. The pressure inside the cabin had torn through the weakened structure, and the plane had split open in the sky. Investigators traced the failure back to a tail strike that had occurred in 1980. At that time, the aircraft had suffered damage while landing in Hong Kong. The repair that followed had been approved and signed off, but not in accordance with Boeing's guidelines. Over the years, multiple maintenance checks had passed over the area. No one had noticed the danger building just beneath the surface. The engineers called it a latent defect, a hidden flaw that had been waiting for the right moment. And on May 25th, 2002, it arrived. It is easy to imagine that a crash must be sudden, violent, unpreventable, but this was not that. This was the result of something long ignored, a ghost inside the machine, a repair done once and never truly questioned again. The investigation results sent shockwaves across the aviation world. A mistake made in 1980 had come back to kill 225 people in 2002. It was not just a technical failure, it was a failure of oversight, a failure of memory, a failure to treat history as something still alive inside the machine. In Taiwan, the grief was overwhelming. Families gathered in airport halls, hoping for names for answers for anything. But there was nothing left to hold. The bodies recovered were few and fragmented. Some families were given only partial remains. Others were told there was nothing to return. For days, television stations showed the wreckage floating on the sea. Reporters stood outside China Airlines headquarters microphones, shaking in the wind, asking the same question again and again. How could this happen? And the truth was, it had already happened, 22 years earlier. The repair that caused the failure had been signed off by maintenance teams, documented, approved, and then forgotten. No one thought to recheck it. No one revisited the site during major overhauls, and so the aircraft kept flying, looking fine, until the day it wasn't. China Airlines grounded several aircraft for inspection. Audits were launched. Boeing issued urgent bulletins reminding airlines around the world to review structural repairs and inspection protocols. Other carriers discovered similar mistakes in old aircraft patches that were never quite right, records that were never re-verified. Around the world, people began to realize just how fragile safety could be when built on assumptions. The families of the victims demanded accountability. They spoke not only of loss, but of betrayal. They had trusted the airline. They had trusted the engineers. They had trusted the system, and the system had told them nothing was wrong. In one interview, a father who lost his wife and daughter said, "I do not blame the sky. I blame the people who looked at that plane and said, yes, it is safe when it was not." The crash site became a memorial. Flowers were left on the shoreline, names carved into stone. And every year on the anniversary, the families returned to stand in silence and remember what should have never happened. And aviation procedures exist to prevent exactly this. Every repair must be logged, verified, re-verified. Every weakness must be addressed at its root. But that only works if people follow through. If the culture values detail more than speed. If memory is treated as a tool, not a burden. What happened on Flight 611 is a lesson written in silence. It teaches that safety is not a result, it is a habit. And when that habit breaks, everything else follows. The plane broke apart in the sky, but the real crack started long before, in the way things were done, in the way small risks were allowed to stay small for too long, in the belief that if something has not failed, yet it never will. That belief is not just wrong, it is deadly. Some accidents fade into the past. This one never did. For the families, there was no full goodbye, no last message, no recovery that brought peace. The plane had broken apart so high, so fast, that even the possibility of final words had been taken away. That kind of silence does not pass. It stays. It follows. It builds its own kind of weight. In the years that followed, investigations turned to education. The case of Flight 611 became part of training manuals, seminars, lectures. Diagrams were shown in classrooms. Photos of the cracked fuselage appeared in slideshows. Engineers were taught what a proper repair should look like. Pilots were reminded what a missing inspection could cost. But outside the classroom, the lesson was harder to teach, because it was not about rivets or metal fatigue or pressurization cycles. It was about human trust, trust in the system, trust that someone has already checked, that a signature on a form means the job is done right. And the truth is, most of the time, that trust holds, until it doesn't. Until a plane with a hidden weakness reaches the end of its life and pulls 200 people with it. The story of Flight 611 is not just technical, it is personal. Because everyone who flies puts their life in the hands of strangers. Strangers with tools. Strangers with checklists. Strangers who walk beneath the wings and decide if they are safe. And those people must care. Not just once. Not just when things go wrong. But every time. In every shift. On every line. The mistake that doomed this flight was not made out of malice. It was made out of routine, out of someone believing good enough was enough. That belief did not kill anyone in 1980, but it waited. It waited through 10,000 takeoffs, through every landing, through every new coat of paint and every maintenance report. It waited until the 25th of May in 2002, and then it ended everything. The passengers on board never knew. They smiled. They read magazines. They listened to music. They leaned against the windows and watched the world pass below. And then it all came apart. They deserved better. They deserved a plane that had no ghosts in its skin. They deserved systems that remembered, and the rest of us deserve to learn from that day. Because no matter how safe we think something is, nothing stays safe if no one keeps watching, not even the sky. Some disasters arrive without warning, and some carry their warning inside them for years, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care. Flight 611 did not fall because of something sudden. It fell because of something forgotten, something that had lived in the metal since a different decade and a different time. What happened that day was not the story of a storm or sabotage. It was the quiet consequence of trust placed in the wrong details. It is a reminder that no part of a machine forgets what was done to it even when we do. A reminder that every shortcut stays somewhere beneath the surface, waiting for pressure to rise, waiting for time to do what negligence begins. When we fly, we trust. When we build, we promise. And when we maintain, we choose whether that trust and that promise will hold not just for today, but for decades to come. The passengers on Flight 611 never got a warning, but we did. We got a map of what happens when inspection becomes routine, when signatures mean more than verification, when something that should have been checked again never was. So if there is something to take from this story, it is this. Safety is not a moment, it is a memory. One we must choose to preserve every single day.